October 1891. The Great Plains tornado had already torn through 3 counties in Nebraska Territory, leaving death and devastation in its wake. At the remote Millbrook Freight Depot, a woman in black mourning dress sat trembling on a wooden crate, clutching a small carpetbag that contained everything she had left in the world. Her husband's funeral had been that morning, and now she had nowhere to go, no money and no family to turn to. What happened next would become the most extraordinary love story ever told across the American frontier, transforming not just 2 broken hearts, but reshaping an entire territory and creating a legacy that would inspire generations to believe in second chances. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The October wind cut across the Nebraska plains like a scythe through wheat, carrying with it the acrid smell of smoke and the distant rumble of thunder that promised another storm. The tornado had passed through Millbrook just after dawn, ripping the roof clean off the grain elevator and scattering freight cars like a child's toys across the prairie. But it was the smaller, more personal devastation that had brought Margaret Rose Sinclair to this desolate depot platform, where she now sat as still as a carved statue, her black mourning dress whipping around her ankles in the relentless wind. Margaret had buried her husband Thomas that very morning in the small cemetery outside of town. Consumption had taken him slowly over 6 months, draining not only his life, but every penny they had saved during their brief 2-year marriage. The medical bills had consumed their modest homestead, the livestock had been sold to pay the doctor, and the funeral expenses had taken the last of their savings. At 26 years old, Margaret Rose was now completely alone in the world, with no living relatives and no means of support. The landlord had already posted eviction notices on the little house she and Thomas had shared, giving her until sunset to vacate. She had come to the depot because she didn't know where else to go. The morning train east had departed hours ago, and she couldn't afford a ticket anyway. The westbound freight wouldn't arrive until the following day if the damaged tracks could be repaired in time. Margaret simply sat on her carpetbag, which contained 2 changes of clothes, her mother's pearl necklace, a daguerreotype of Thomas, and exactly 73 cents in coins. Her fingers were blue with cold, and her lips had long since lost their color, but she seemed unaware of her physical discomfort, lost as she was in the overwhelming grief and desperation of her circumstances. The sound of approaching horses made her look up for the first time in hours. Through the settling dust and debris scattered by the tornado, she could see a group of riders approaching from the south. Even from a distance, it was clear that these were not ordinary travelers. The horses were magnificent animals, clearly, well-bred and well cared for, and the men who rode them carried themselves with the confidence of those accustomed to command. At the head of the group rode a man who immediately commanded attention, not just for his obvious wealth evidenced by his fine clothes and equipment, but for the natural authority in his bearing. William Harrison Blackwood was 32 years old and the owner of the largest cattle empire in Nebraska Territory. The Blackwood Ranch sprawled across nearly 200,000 acres, stretching from the Platte River to the Colorado border, and employed over 300 men year-round. Will had built his fortune through a combination of shrewd business, sense, fair dealing, and an almost supernatural ability to read both the land and the men who worked it. He had come to Millbrook that morning to assess the tornado damage to his grain storage facilities and to check on the welfare of the families who worked his scattered line camps. As Will drew closer to the depot, his attention was caught by the solitary figure in black sitting motionless on the platform. Something about her absolute stillness, the way she seemed to have withdrawn into herself, struck him as profoundly wrong. This was a woman in distress, and Will Blackwood had been raised by a mother who had drilled into him from childhood that a gentleman never ignored a lady in need. He reined in his horse and dismounted, handing the reins to his foreman, Jake Morrison, without taking his eyes off the woman. Margaret heard the footsteps approaching, but didn't look up. She had learned over the past months of Thomas's illness that charity, no matter how well-intentioned, always came with a price, and she had no currency left with which to pay. She simply stared at her folded hands, hoping that whoever it was would pass by and leave her to her misery. "Ma'am," came a deep, warm voice above her. "Are you all right?" The genuine concern in the stranger's voice made Margaret finally raise her eyes. The man standing before her was tall and broad-shouldered, with dark hair touched with silver at the temples, and kind brown eyes that seemed to see right through her brave facade to the desperation beneath. His clothes were clearly expensive, but practical, the attire of a successful rancher rather than a city dandy. There was something solid and reassuring about his presence, but Margaret had learned not to trust her instincts when it came to men offering help. "I'm fine, thank you," she managed to say, though her voice came out as barely more than a whisper, and her chattering teeth made the words difficult to understand. Will studied her more carefully. Her dress was black silk, well made, but not new, appropriate for mourning. Her face was pale with cold and exhaustion, but he could see that she was a beautiful woman, with delicate features and auburn hair that caught the afternoon light. More importantly, he could see the signs of recent grief in her red-rimmed eyes and the way she held herself, as if she were afraid she might shatter if she moved too quickly. "Ma'am, I don't mean to be forward, but you don't look fine at all. You look like you're about to freeze to death, and there's another storm coming in from the west. The depot isn't heated, and the depot master went to Omaha yesterday to file insurance claims for the tornado damage. You can't stay here tonight?" Margaret looked up at him again, and this time Will could see the flash of fear in her green eyes. She was afraid of him, or perhaps afraid of accepting help from any man. It was a reaction he had seen before in women who had been disappointed or mistreated, and it made his heart ache for whatever pain she had endured. "I have nowhere else to go," she admitted quietly, and the simple honesty of the statement broke Will's heart completely. "What's your name, ma'am?" he asked gently, crouching down so that he was at eye level with her instead of looming over her. "Margaret Sinclair. Mrs. Margaret Sinclair." She emphasized the title, perhaps hoping it would afford her some protection. "Mrs. Sinclair, I'm Will Blackwood. I own a ranch about 20 miles south of here. I came to town to check on the tornado damage, but I can't in good conscience leave you here to freeze. Please, let me take you somewhere warm and safe. You can stay at my ranch tonight, and tomorrow we can figure out what to do next." Margaret stared at him, searching his face for any sign of ulterior motives. She had heard stories about what happened to women who found themselves alone and desperate on the frontier, and she was terrified of trading one form of misery for another. But she was also practical enough to realize that she would indeed freeze to death if she spent the night at the depot, and this man seemed different from the others who had offered her help over the past few months. There was something in his eyes that reminded her of her father, a steadiness and integrity that she instinctively trusted. "Mr. Blackwood, I appreciate your kindness, but I can't pay you for room and board. I have nothing to offer in return for your hospitality." Will stood up and extended his hand to her. "Mrs. Sinclair, hospitality isn't something that requires payment. It's something that decent people offer to other decent people when they're in need. My mother would roll over in her grave if she knew I left a lady in distress to freeze it." "A depot, please, let me help you." Margaret looked at his outstretched hand for a long moment. She could feel the eyes of his men watching the interaction, and she was acutely aware that whatever decision she made now would determine not just where she spent the night, but possibly the entire course of her future. There was something about Will Blackwood that inspired confidence, a sense that he was a man who kept his word and honored his commitments. Against her better judgment, but with no real alternative, she placed her small, cold hand in his large, warm one. "Thank you, Mr. Blackwood," she said quietly. "I accept your offer." Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us now. Back to the story. The relief that flooded Will's face was genuine and unmistakable. He helped her to her feet, noting how light she was and how she swayed slightly when she stood, probably from hunger as much as cold. He picked up her carpet bag with one hand while steadying her with the other, then led her toward the horses. "Jake," he called to his foreman, "Mrs. Sinclair will be riding with us back to the ranch. She'll be staying in the guest room in the main house. I want you to make sure the men understand that she's to be treated with the utmost respect." Jake. Morrison had worked for Will Blackwood for 15 years, and he had never seen his boss so immediately protective of anyone. "Yes, sir, Mr. Blackwood. Should I ride ahead and tell Miss Catherine to prepare the room?" "That would be appreciated. Jake, and tell her to have Cookie prepare something hot to eat. Mrs. Sinclair looks like she could use a good meal." As Will helped Margaret mount one of the spare horses, she couldn't help but notice the easy authority with which he spoke to his men, and the obvious respect they showed him in return. This was clearly a man accustomed to command, but there was nothing harsh or domineering in his manner. He treated his employees more like trusted friends than hired hands, and they responded with loyalty rather than fear. The ride to the Blackwood Ranch took them through some of the most beautiful country Margaret had ever seen. Despite the recent tornado damage, the landscape was breathtaking in its vastness and variety. Rolling hills covered in autumn grass stretched to the horizon, broken by stands of cottonwood and oak trees whose leaves had turned brilliant shades of gold and red. In the distance, she could see herds of cattle grazing peacefully, apparently unaffected by the morning's weather drama. As they rode, Will pointed out various landmarks and told her about the history of the area. He had a natural storyteller's gift, and Margaret found herself relaxing for the first time in months as she listened to his tales of the early settlers, the conflicts with hostile tribes, and the gradual transformation of the territory from wilderness to civilization. It was clear that he loved this land with a deep and abiding passion, and his enthusiasm was infectious. "My father came here in 1869. Will explained, as they paused at the top of a hill to rest the horses. He was one of the first cattlemen to recognize the potential of this country. Most people thought it was too wild, too dangerous, too far from civilization to ever amount to anything, but my father saw what it could become, with the right combination of hard work, patience, and respect for the land itself." Margaret looked out over the vast expanse of prairie and could see what his father had envisioned. Even in its current undeveloped state, there was something magnificent about the endless sky and rolling grassland. It was a landscape that seemed to promise infinite possibilities for those brave enough to seize them. "Did he live to see his vision realized?" she asked. Will's expression grew thoughtful. "He died 5 years ago, just as the ranch was really beginning to prosper, but I think he knew what we were building here. He used to say that the land would reward those who treated it with respect and punish those who tried to take more than they gave back. So far, he's been right." As they crested another hill, the Blackwood Ranch headquarters came into view, and Margaret gasped at the sight. She had expected a simple ranch house, perhaps a bit larger than average, but essentially similar to the modest homestead she was familiar with. Instead, she found herself looking at what could only be described as a small town built around a magnificent central residence. The main house was a sprawling two-story structure built of local stone and timber, with a wide veranda that wrapped around 3 sides and tall windows that gleamed in the afternoon sun. Surrounding it were dozens of other buildings, bunkhouses, barns, corrals, workshops, a blacksmith shop, and what appeared to be a small schoolhouse. Smoke rose from numerous chimneys, and she could see people moving about their daily tasks with the purposeful efficiency of a well-organized community. "My goodness," Margaret breathed. "It's like a small city." Will smiled with obvious pride. "During roundup season, we have close to 400 people living here. We've had to become almost completely self-sufficient. We have our own blacksmith, carpenter, doctor, and even a teacher for the children of the married hands. It's become more than just a ranch, it's a community." As they rode into the central compound, Margaret was struck by the obvious prosperity and organization of the She operation. The buildings were all well maintained, the corrals were sturdy and well designed, and the horses and cattle she could see were clearly healthy and well cared for. But more than that, she was impressed by the atmosphere of the place, the people. They passed, called out friendly greetings to Will, and their attitude toward him was one of genuine affection and respect, rather than mere deference to his wealth and position. A woman emerged from the main house as they dismounted, and Margaret could immediately see the family resemblance. Catherine Blackwood was perhaps 40 years old, with the same warm brown eyes as her brother and prematurely grey hair pulled back in a practical bun. She was dressed simply but elegantly, and she carried herself with the confident bearing of a woman accustomed to managing a large household. "Will," she called, hurrying down the front steps. "Jake told me you were bringing a guest. Mrs. Sinclair, isn't it?" "You poor dear, you look absolutely frozen. Come inside immediately, and let's get you warmed up." Margaret found herself swept up in Catherine's capable hands and ushered into the house before she could protest. The interior of the main house was even more impressive than the exterior, furnished with beautiful pieces that managed to be both elegant and comfortable. A fire was already blazing in the massive stone fireplace, and the warmth felt like heaven after hours in the cold wind. "Catherine, this is Mrs. Margaret Sinclair," Will said, following them into the parlour. "She's recently widowed and found herself stranded at the depot after the tornado damage. I've offered her our hospitality until she can make other arrangements." Catherine's expression immediately softened with sympathy. "Oh, my dear, I'm so sorry for your loss. You must be exhausted and heartbroken. Don't you worry about anything. We'll take good care of you. Will, stop hovering and let me get this poor woman settled properly." Despite her grief and exhaustion, Margaret found herself almost smiling at the obvious affection between the siblings and Catherine's take-charge attitude. It was clear that while Will might own the ranch, Catherine ran the household with the same efficiency and authority that he brought to the cattle operation. "Thank you both," Margaret said quietly. "I don't know what I would have done if Mr. Blackwood hadn't found me. Your kindness is overwhelming." "Nonsense," Catherine replied briskly. "Kindness is just good sense dressed up in fancy clothes. Now, let's get you upstairs to a proper room where you can rest and clean up. I've had Cookie prepare a hot meal, and after you've eaten and rested, we can talk about whatever you'd like to do next. There's no pressure and no hurry. You're welcome here for as long as you need to stay," as Catherine led her upstairs to what was clearly the finest guest room Margaret had ever seen. She found herself wondering if this was all some kind of wonderful dream brought on by cold and hunger. The room was spacious and beautifully furnished, with a large bed covered in quilts that looked both expensive and comfortable, a writing desk by the window, and a wardrobe that was already stocked with women's clothing in what appeared to be her size. "The clothes belonged to my late sister-in-law," Catherine explained, noticing Margaret's surprised look. "Rebecca was about your size, and I thought you might need a change of clothes. Will asked me to make sure you had everything you needed." Margaret felt tears prick her eyes at this thoughtfulness. "I don't know how to thank you. Your brother is incredibly generous." Catherine smiled and patted her hand gently. "Will is a good man. perhaps the best I've ever known. He sees someone in need, and he simply can't rest until he's done whatever he can to help. It's both his greatest strength and his greatest weakness, if you ask me. Now you rest for a bit and I'll send someone up with hot water for a bath and some food. We'll talk more at dinner. Left alone in the beautiful room, Margaret sank into the comfortable chair by the window and allowed herself to truly absorb what had happened to her. This morning she had been destitute and desperate, facing a future that seemed to hold nothing but hardship and uncertainty. Now she found herself in luxury she had never dreamed of, surrounded by people who were treating her with kindness and respect. Despite knowing nothing about her beyond her obvious need, she looked out the window at the bustling activity of the ranch and tried to understand why Will Blackwood had gone so far out of his way to help a complete stranger. She had encountered enough men over the past few months to know that such generosity usually came with expectations, but there had been nothing in his manner to suggest any ulterior motives. He had treated her with the same respect he would have shown to any lady of his own social class, despite her obvious poverty and desperate circumstances. As the afternoon wore on and Margaret finally allowed herself to truly rest for the first time in months, she began to feel something she had thought lost forever: hope. She didn't know what the future would bring, but for the first time since Thomas's death, she believed that it might hold something better than mere survival. And at the center of that tentative hope was the image of a tall, kind man with warm brown eyes who had seen her at her lowest point and offered her dignity instead of charity, respect instead of pity. Outside her window, the sun was setting over the vast Nebraska prairie, painting the sky in brilliant shades of orange and purple. Tomorrow would bring new challenges and decisions, but tonight she was safe, warm, and fed. For a woman who had lost everything, it felt like a miracle. Margaret woke to the sound of voices drifting through her window and the unfamiliar sensation of having slept deeply and peacefully for the first time in months. Sunlight streamed through the lace curtains, casting dancing patterns on the polished wooden floor, and for a moment she couldn't remember where she was. Then the events of the previous day came flooding back, and she sat up quickly, disoriented by the luxury of her surroundings. A soft knock at the door interrupted her thoughts. "Mrs. Sinclair, it's Catherine. May I come in?" "Of course." Margaret called, hastily smoothing her hair and the borrowed nightgown she had found laid out for her the evening before. Catherine entered carrying a breakfast tray that smelled absolutely divine. "I thought you might prefer to eat in your room this morning, while you get your bearings. Will had to ride out early to check on some cattle that might have been scattered by yesterday's storm, but he asked me to make sure you knew you were welcome to stay as long as you like." Margaret accepted the tray gratefully, surprised by how hungry she was. The food was simple but perfectly prepared: fresh eggs, thick slices of bacon, biscuits with honey, and coffee that was stronger and more flavorful than anything she had tasted in years. As she ate, Catherine settled into the chair by the window and studied her with the frank assessment of a woman who had spent years managing a large household. "You have beautiful hands," Catherine observed, noting Margaret's long, graceful fingers. "Have you done much needlework?" Margaret nodded, swallowing a bite of biscuit. "My mother taught me when I was young. I've always enjoyed embroidery and fine sewing. Thomas used to say I could make silk purses out of anything, even so's ears." Her voice caught slightly at the mention of her late husband. Catherine's expression softened with understanding. "How long were you married, dear?" 2 years, Margaret replied quietly. "We met when he came through my hometown selling farm equipment. He was so full of dreams and plans for the future. We bought a little homestead outside of Millbrook and were going to raise wheat and maybe some cattle. But then he got sick and—" She trailed off, unable to finish the sentence. "I'm so sorry," Catherine said gently. "Losing someone you love is never easy, but losing them when you're both so young and had so many plans together Must be particularly heartbreaking. Margaret nodded, surprised by how easy it was to talk to this woman. There was something about Catherine's manner that invited confidences without making her feel like she was being interrogated or judged. "What will you do now?" Catherine asked carefully. "Do you have family somewhere? Plans for the future?" Margaret set down her coffee cup with a slight tremor in her hands. "I have no family left. My parents died of fever when I was 16, and Thomas was an only child like myself. As for plans—" She laughed bitterly. "I had planned to spend the rest of my life with my husband on our little farm. I never thought I would need any other plans." Catherine was quiet for a moment, studying Margaret's face with the shrewd assessment of a woman who had spent years evaluating people and situations. "Can you read and write well?" she asked suddenly. Margaret looked surprised by the question. "Yes, of course. My mother was a school teacher before she married, and she made sure I had a proper education. I can do figures as well, and I speak some French and German." "Interesting," Catherine murmured, and Margaret could see the wheels turning in her mind. "Tell me, what do you know about running a household? Not just cooking and cleaning, but managing staff, planning menus, keeping accounts, organizing social events?" "I managed our homestead, of course, but that was very different from—" Margaret gestured around the elegant room. "I've never dealt with anything on this scale." "Why do you ask?" Catherine smiled mysteriously. "Just curious. Now finish your breakfast and get dressed. I want to show you around the ranch properly. There's a lot more to this place than you saw yesterday." An hour later, Margaret found herself following Catherine on a comprehensive tour of the Blackwood Ranch operation. What she saw amazed her. This was not simply a cattle ranch, but a complex business enterprise that included farming, horse breeding, a lumber mill, a general store, and even a small bank that served the scattered homesteaders in the region. Will's father started with just cattle, Catherine explained as they walked through the bustling central compound. But Will has expanded into every aspect of frontier life. He saw that people needed goods and services, so he provided them. It's made the ranch incredibly profitable, but more importantly, it's created jobs and opportunities for hundreds of families. They stopped at the schoolhouse, where Margaret could hear children reciting their lessons. Through the window, she could see a young woman leading a class of about 20 children, ranging in age from 6 to 16. "That's Miss Emily Patterson," Catherine said. "She's our teacher, wonderful with the children, but—" She hesitated, then continued more quietly. "She's been talking about leaving to get married. Her beau has a homestead in Colorado Territory, and he wants her to come west with him." Margaret felt a sudden pang of anxiety. That would leave the children without a teacher. Exactly. And finding qualified teachers willing to come to such a remote location is nearly impossible. Most educated women want to stay in the cities, where there are more opportunities and comforts. Catherine glanced sideways at Margaret. It's been a constant worry for Will. He believes strongly that education is the key to the territory's future, but we can't provide education without teachers. They continued their tour, visiting the ranch's impressive library, the medical clinic, where a young doctor treated both ranch employees and local settlers, and the workshops where skilled craftsmen produced everything from saddles to furniture. At each stop, Catherine introduced Margaret to the people they met, and Margaret was struck by how warmly they greeted her and how respectfully they spoke of Will. "Mr. Blackwood saved my family," one woman told her as they visited the community garden. "My husband was injured in a logging accident, and we had nowhere to go. Mr. Blackwood gave him work he could do sitting down and made sure we had a house and enough food. There aren't many men like him in this world." As the morning progressed, Margaret began to understand that she was seeing something truly extraordinary. Will Blackwood had created more than a successful business. He had built a functioning community, that provided security, opportunity, and hope to hundreds of people. It was a vision of what the American frontier could become with the right leadership and resources. They were walking back toward the main house when they encountered a group of riders approaching at a gallop. Margaret recognized Will immediately, even from a distance, by his confident bearing and the way he sat his horse. But as the group drew closer, she could see that something was wrong. The men looked grim, and there was an urgency in their pace that suggested trouble. Will dismounted quickly when he saw them, his face tight with concern. "Catherine, Mrs. Sinclair, I'm glad you're here. We have a problem." "What's happened?" Catherine asked immediately. "The Patterson homestead was hit hard by the tornado, much worse than we initially thought. The house is completely destroyed, and old man Patterson is hurt bad. Emily's trying to care for him, but she's in over her head. Dr. Mitchell is with a difficult birth at the Hendricks place and can't get there until tomorrow at the earliest." Margaret felt her heart clench with sympathy. "Is there anything we can do to help?" Will looked at her with surprise, as if he had forgotten she was there. "That's kind of you to offer, Mrs. Sinclair, but the Patterson place is 20 miles from here, and the conditions are rough. It's no place for—" He paused, clearly trying to find a diplomatic way to say it wasn't suitable for a lady. "For a woman?" Margaret finished quietly. "Mr. Blackwood, I may not look like much right now, but I'm stronger than I appear. I've nursed sick people before, including my husband during his final illness. If there's someone who needs help, I'd like to offer what assistance I can." Will studied her face carefully, seeing something in her green eyes that made him reconsider his initial dismissal. This was not a helpless woman looking for someone to take care of her. This was someone offering to help others, despite her own recent losses and current difficulties. It would mean riding hard over rough country, he warned, and the Patterson place is primitive even by frontier standards. There's no guarantee we can make it there and back before dark, and if we get caught out overnight— "I understand the risks," Margaret said firmly, "but if I can help save someone's life or ease their suffering, I'm willing to take those risks." Catherine looked back and forth between her brother and Margaret, and a slow smile spread across her face. "Will, I think you should take her. Mrs. Sinclair is right. She's stronger than she looks. And from what I've seen this morning, she has good sense and a kind heart. The Pattersons could use all the help they can get." Will was clearly torn between his desire to help the Patterson family and his instinct to protect Margaret from hardship and danger. Finally, his practical nature won out. "All right, Mrs. Sinclair, if you're truly willing, we could use your help, but I want you to understand this won't be a pleasant ride, and what we find at the Patterson place might not be easy to see." "I understand," Margaret replied simply. "When do we leave?" "As soon as you can change into riding clothes. Catherine, can you—" "Already on it," Catherine said, hurrying toward the house. "I'll get her some of Rebecca's things. They should fit well enough." 20 minutes later, Margaret found herself dressed in a split riding skirt, boots, and a practical jacket that fit her surprisingly well. Catherine had also provided her with gloves and a wide-brimmed hat to protect her from the sun. As she looked at herself in the mirror, Margaret was struck by how different she appeared. Gone was the helpless widow in mourning clothes. In her place stood a woman who looked capable of handling whatever challenges lay ahead. The ride to the Patterson homestead was indeed grueling. They traveled across open prairie, through creek beds still swollen from the recent rains, and over rocky terrain that would have been challenging even in good weather. The aftermath of the tornado had left fallen trees and debris scattered across their path, forcing them to take detours that added miles to their journey. But Margaret surprised herself with how well she managed. The months of caring for Thomas during his illness had given her a core of strength she hadn't realized she possessed, and the borrowed horse, one of Will's gentler mares, responded well to her handling. More than once, Will glanced back at her with obvious approval as she navigated a difficult section of trail or kept pace with the group despite the challenging conditions. As they rode, Will found himself studying Margaret more carefully than he had the previous day. Away from the depot and her obvious distress, she showed a composure and determination that impressed him. She asked intelligent questions about the country they were passing through and showed genuine interest in his explanations of the local geography and wildlife. There was clearly more to Mrs. Margaret Sinclair than a pretty face and tragic circumstances. "Tell me about the Patterson family," Margaret said as they paused to rest the horses beside a small creek. "John Patterson is one of the original settlers in this area," Will explained. "He came here about 15 years ago with his wife and baby daughter, built his homestead with his own hands, cleared the land, fought off Indian raids, survived. Droughts and blizzards. His wife died about 5 years ago, and since then it's just been him and Emily. She's been teaching our school for the past 3 years, but she's also been taking care of her father. It's been a hard life for both of them. And now Emily might leave to get married." Will nodded grimly. "Can't say I blame her. She's sacrificed enough of her youth taking care of everyone else. She deserves a chance at happiness, but it leaves us in a difficult position, both for the school and for her father's care." Margaret was quiet for a moment, processing this information. "What will happen to Mr. Patterson if Emily leaves?" "That's been keeping me awake at night," Will admitted. "He's too proud to accept charity, too old to start over somewhere else, and too set in his ways to adapt to living with other people. But he can't manage on his own much longer, especially if he's seriously injured." When they finally reached the Patterson homestead, Margaret understood why Will had tried to prepare her for what they would find. The tornado had completely destroyed the small cabin, leaving only a pile of splintered wood and twisted metal. A makeshift shelter had been erected using salvaged boards and canvas, and smoke rising from a small fire indicated that someone was indeed still there. Emily Patterson emerged from the shelter as they approached, and Margaret's heart went out to her immediately. The young woman was perhaps 22 years old, with brown hair that had escaped from its pins and a face streaked with tears and exhaustion. Her dress was torn and dirty, and she looked like she hadn't slept in days. "Mr. Blackwood?" Emily called out, relief evident in her voice. "Thank God you've come. Father is hurt worse than I thought, and I don't know what to do. He's been unconscious since yesterday evening, and I'm scared he's going to die." Will dismounted quickly and helped Margaret down from her horse. "This is Mrs. Sinclair, Emily. She's offered to help with your father's care. She has experience nursing sick people." Emily looked at Margaret with desperate hope. "Oh, Mrs. Sinclair, would you please look at him? I've done what I could, but I'm afraid it's not enough." Margaret followed Emily into the makeshift shelter, and her heart sank at what she found. John Patterson was a man of perhaps 55, grey-haired and weathered by years of frontier life. He lay unconscious on a pile of quilts, his breathing shallow and laboured. A crude bandage around his head was soaked with blood, and his left arm was clearly broken. Margaret knelt beside him and began a careful examination, drawing on everything she had learned during Thomas's illness and from helping the local doctor in Millbrook when he was overwhelmed with patients. John's pulse was weak but steady, his pupils were responsive to light, and while the head wound looked serious, it didn't appear to have penetrated the skull. "Emily," she said calmly, "I need you to help me. First, we need clean water and more light. Can you and the men build up the fire and bring in some lanterns?" For the next several hours, Margaret worked over John Patterson with a skill and confidence that amazed everyone present. She cleaned and properly dressed his head wound, set and splinted his broken arm, and managed to get some water and broth down his throat even while he remained unconscious. She worked with calm efficiency, giving quiet instructions to Emily. And the ranch hands, never showing the least sign of squeamishness or uncertainty. Will watched her work with growing admiration and something else he couldn't quite identify. This was clearly a woman of intelligence and capability, someone who could face a crisis and respond with both compassion and practical skill. The transformation from the helpless widow he had found at the depot to this competent take-charge woman was remarkable. As evening approached and John's condition stabilized, Margaret finally allowed herself to rest. She sat beside the fire, her borrowed clothes dirty and her hair disheveled, but there was a light in her eyes that had been absent the day before. "Mrs. Sinclair," Emily said quietly, "I don't know how to thank you. You saved my father's life." "We're not out of the woods yet," Margaret replied practically. "He needs to regain consciousness and show that there's no serious brain injury, but his vital signs are encouraging. With proper care and rest, I think he'll recover." Will approached them carrying tin cups of coffee. "That was remarkable work. Mrs. Sinclair, where did you learn to handle injuries like that?" Margaret accepted the coffee gratefully. "Necessity, mostly. Our town doctor was elderly and often called away to other settlements. When people were hurt or sick, the women had to learn to help each other. And during Thomas's illness, I learned more about medicine than I ever wanted to know." "Well, you have a real gift for it," Will said sincerely. "John Patterson owes you his life." As they prepared to spend the night at the Patterson place, it was too dangerous to attempt the return journey in the dark. Margaret found herself in conversation with Emily about the challenges of frontier life. The younger woman spoke openly about her fears for her father's future and her own conflicted feelings about leaving him to get married. "I love James," Emily confided, "and I want to be his wife. But how can I abandon my father when he needs me, especially now with his injuries? I don't see how I can leave him." Margaret listened thoughtfully. "What does your heart tell you to do?" "My heart is torn in two," Emily replied sadly. "I want to follow James to Colorado, but I also want to care for my father. I can't do both." "Perhaps," Margaret said carefully, "there might be another solution. What if your father wasn't alone? What if there was someone else who could help care for him?" Emily looked at her hopefully. "Do you mean someone like a housekeeper?" "Father would never accept that. He's too proud." "I was thinking of something more like a partnership," Margaret said, the idea taking shape as she spoke. "Someone who could help him rebuild and manage the homestead in exchange for a place to live and a share in the work. Not charity, but a mutual arrangement that benefits both parties." Will had been listening to this conversation from across the fire, and he felt a sudden surge of understanding. Margaret wasn't just offering comfort to Emily. She was proposing a solution that could benefit everyone involved. And more than that, she was showing him yet another facet of her character, the ability to see possibilities where others saw only problems. The next morning brought encouraging news. John Patterson regained consciousness shortly after dawn, and, while he was weak and confused, he showed no signs of serious brain injury. Margaret continued to monitor his condition carefully, but she was confident that with proper care, he would make a full recovery. As they prepared to return to the Blackwood Ranch, Emily took Margaret aside. "Mrs. Sinclair, I've been thinking about what you said last night, about finding someone to help Father. Were you thinking of yourself?" Margaret looked around at the destroyed homestead, then back at Emily's hopeful face. It's possible. I need a place to live and work to do. Your father needs help rebuilding and managing this place. It might be a solution that could work for everyone." "But you're a lady," Emily protested. "This is rough country, hard work, primitive conditions. Surely you would prefer something more civilized." Margaret smiled sadly. "Emily, I've learned that life rarely gives us what we prefer, but sometimes it gives us what we need. And right now, I need a purpose, a place where I can be useful. Your father's homestead might provide that." That evening, back at the Blackwood Ranch, Margaret sat in the beautiful guest room and tried to make sense of everything that had happened in the past 2 days. She had come here as a desperate woman with no options and no future. Now she found herself contemplating a new life, a new purpose, and possibly a new beginning. There was a soft knock at her door, and she opened it to find Will standing in the hallway, looking unusually serious. "Mrs. Sinclair, could I speak with you for a moment? I have a proposition I'd like to discuss with you." Margaret's heart skipped a beat, but she managed to keep her voice steady. "Of course, Mr. Blackwood. Please, come in." Will entered and took the chair by the window, his expression thoughtful. "I've been thinking about your conversation with Emily last night, and about what I observed during your care of John Patterson. I have an idea that might benefit everyone involved, but I wanted to discuss it with you before I mention it to anyone else." Margaret settled into the chair across from him, intrigued. "I'm listening. What would you say to a more permanent arrangement here at the ranch? Not as a guest, but as an employee, specifically as our head housekeeper and social secretary. Catherine has been trying to manage the household affairs along with her other responsibilities, and it's becoming too much for her. We need someone with education, refinement, and management skills to handle the social aspects of the ranch business and coordinate the household staff." Margaret stared at him in surprise. "Mr. Blackwood, I'm flattered by your confidence in me, but I'm not sure I'm qualified for such a position. I've never managed a household like this." "But you have managed a household," Will pointed out. "And more importantly, you've shown intelligence, adaptability, and the ability to remain calm under pressure. You handled the crisis at the Patterson place better than most men I know, and your education and refinement would be invaluable in dealing with our business contacts and social obligations." Margaret felt a flutter of excitement at the possibility he was describing. What exactly would such a position entail? Managing the household staff, planning and organizing social events, handling correspondence, keeping the accounts for household expenses, and serving as hostess when we entertain business associates. It would also involve overseeing the school. Until we can find a permanent replacement for Emily, and possibly helping with medical emergencies like yesterday's. And the compensation? Room and board in the main house, plus a salary that would allow you to save money and eventually establish your own independence if you chose to. More importantly, you would be a valued member of our community, with the respect and security that comes with that position. Margaret's mind raced with the possibilities. It was far more than she had dared to hope for. Not just employment, but a career that would use her skills and provide her with genuine independence. "There's one more thing," Will continued, his voice becoming slightly hesitant. "The position would require you to interact closely with me and to accompany me to various social and business functions. I want you to understand that your employment would never be contingent on anything other than your professional performance, but I also want you to be aware that people might talk." Margaret met his eyes directly. "Mr. Blackwood, are you offering me employment or something else?" Will had the grace to flush slightly. "Employment, Mrs. Sinclair, strictly employment. But I'd be lying if I said I wasn't personally interested in getting to know you better. You're a remarkable woman, and I find myself drawn to your strength and intelligence. However, I give you my word that your position here would never depend on your personal feelings toward me." Margaret was quiet for a long moment, studying this man who had already shown her more kindness and respect than she had encountered in months. She could see the sincerity in his eyes, and she believed his assurances about keeping their professional and personal relationships separate. "Mr. Blackwood," she said finally, "I accept your offer, but I want to be clear about my own circumstances. I'm still in mourning for my husband, and I'm not ready for any kind of romantic entanglement. If you can accept that limitation, then I would be honored to serve as your head housekeeper and social secretary." Will smiled. and Margaret felt her heart skip again at the warmth in his expression. "Mrs. Sinclair, I can accept any limitations you set. The important thing is that you're willing to stay and become part of our community. I have a feeling you're going to fit in here better than you might expect." As Will left her room that night, Margaret stood at the window looking out over the moonlit prairie. 2 days ago, she had been a destitute widow with no future. Now she had employment, purpose, and the beginning of what might become a new life. More than that, she had met a man who treated her as an equal, who valued her mind as much as her appearance, and who offered her respect rather than pity. She thought of Thomas and felt a pang of guilt at how quickly her life was changing. But she also felt something she hadn't experienced in months. Excitement about the future. Tomorrow would bring new challenges and new opportunities, and for the first time since her husband's death, Margaret felt ready to face them. 6 weeks. Into her new position as head housekeeper and social secretary of the Blackwood Ranch, Margaret found herself facing the most challenging test of her capabilities yet. Word had arrived that Senator Harrison Caldwell and his entourage would be visiting the territory to assess its readiness for statehood, and they had specifically requested to tour the Blackwood operation as an example of successful frontier enterprise. The visit would include not only the senator but also his wife, 2 other territorial officials, a newspaper correspondent from Chicago, and various local dignitaries. It would be the largest and most important social gathering ever held at the ranch. Margaret stood in the ranch's newly converted ballroom, surveying the transformation she had orchestrated over the past 3 weeks. What had once been a utilitarian storage space was now an elegant reception hall, complete with crystal chandeliers Will had ordered from Denver, polished hardwood floors, and decorative elements that somehow managed to be both sophisticated and appropriately Western. The logistics alone had been staggering. Coordinating the arrival of supplies, managing the expanded kitchen staff, arranging accommodations for 36 guests, and planning entertainment that would showcase the ranch's achievements while providing suitable amusement for dignitaries accustomed to Washington society. Catherine entered the ballroom, carrying a thick folder of correspondence and wearing an expression of barely controlled panic. "Margaret, we have a crisis. The string quartet from Omaha just sent word that they can't make it. Their train was delayed by a washout near Grand Island. We have 48 hours until the senator arrives, and no music for the reception." Margaret had learned over the past weeks that Catherine, for all her competence in ranch matters, became overwhelmed when faced with large-scale social events. It was one of the reasons Will had been so eager to find someone to take over these responsibilities. "Don't worry," Margaret said calmly, making notes on her ever-present clipboard. "I've already anticipated this possibility. There's a military band stationed at Fort Robinson. I sent an inquiry 3 days ago about their availability. If they can't come, young Timothy Morrison plays violin beautifully, and I've discovered that Cookie's nephew has quite a talent with the harmonica. We can create a perfectly charming frontier musical ensemble." Catherine stared at her in amazement. "How do you think of these things? And when did you have time to investigate all these alternatives?" Margaret smiled as she adjusted the position of a particularly stubborn floral arrangement. "When you're planning an event of this magnitude, you don't just need a plan. You need a plan for when the plan fails, and a plan for when that plan fails too. It's all about anticipating problems before they become crises." This was precisely the kind of thinking that had made Margaret invaluable to the ranch operation over the past month and a half. She had completely reorganized the household management system, streamlined the correspondence procedures, and somehow managed to reduce costs while improving efficiency. More importantly, she had begun to transform the ranch's social standing in the territory. Her first major innovation had been the establishment of monthly social gatherings for the wives and families of neighboring ranchers and homesteaders. These events, which she called Territory Ladies' Afternoons, had become wildly popular and served multiple purposes. They provided isolated frontier women with much-needed social contact, created opportunities for sharing practical information about everything from medical remedies to food preservation, and subtly established the Blackwood Ranch as the social center of the region. But Margaret's influence extended far beyond party planning. She had also instituted a lending library program, where books could be borrowed and exchanged among the scattered homesteads. She had organized a correspondence network that allowed families to share news and maintain connections across vast distances. Most innovatively, she had established what she called the Territory Skills Exchange, where people could trade services and knowledge. A blacksmith might teach metalworking in exchange for lessons in reading, or a seamstress might provide clothing repair in return for help with bookkeeping. These programs had not gone unnoticed by territorial officials, and it was largely due to Margaret's reputation as a community organizer that Senator Caldwell had specifically requested to visit the Blackwood Ranch. Word of the innovative social programs had reached the territorial capital, and the senator wanted to see firsthand how successful frontier communities were developing. Will appeared in the doorway of the ballroom, and Margaret felt the familiar flutter in her chest that occurred whenever he entered a room. Over the past weeks, their working relationship had deepened into something more complex and emotionally charged, though both had been careful to maintain professional boundaries. Will had proven to be an attentive and supportive employer, often seeking her advice on matters that went far beyond household management. Margaret, in turn, had found herself increasingly drawn to his vision for the territory's future and his genuine commitment to the welfare of his employees and neighbors. The advance team just arrived, Will announced. 3 men from the senator's staff, plus the newspaper correspondent. They want to inspect the facilities and interview some of the ranch hands about working conditions. He paused, studying Margaret's face with the intensity that had become familiar over their weeks of working together. "Are you ready for this?" Margaret straightened her shoulders and smoothed her dark blue dress, one of several she had ordered, to replace her morning clothes, reasoning that her new position required more appropriate attire. As ready as anyone can be for having their life's work scrutinized by politicians and journalists, the question is, are you ready to have your ranch examined under a microscope? Will grinned, and Margaret felt that traitorous flutter again. "I think we can stand up to scrutiny. The real question is whether Washington politicians are ready for what we've built here." The next 48 hours passed in a whirlwind of final preparations, last-minute crises, and barely controlled chaos. Margaret found herself managing everything from diplomatic protocol disputes to a kitchen fire that nearly derailed the entire catering plan. But she also discovered something unexpected about herself. She thrived under this kind of pressure. The skills she had developed managing her household during Thomas's illness, combined with her natural organizational abilities and quick thinking, made her uniquely suited for the complex challenges of frontier diplomacy. The most delicate situation arose when she learned that Mrs. Caldwell, the senator's wife, had very definite opinions about the proper social order and was reportedly less than enthusiastic about the idea of frontier communities achieving statehood. Margaret realized that winning over Mrs. Caldwell would be crucial to the success of the entire visit. Her solution was typically innovative. Rather than trying to impress Mrs. Caldwell with an imitation of Eastern sophistication, Margaret decided to showcase the unique strengths and opportunities of frontier life. She arranged for a demonstration of traditional frontier skills: quilting, food preservation, medicinal herb preparation, presented not as primitive necessities, but as valuable cultural knowledge that Eastern society had lost. She organized a children's program that highlighted the educational opportunities available even in remote areas. Most cleverly, she arranged for several of the territory's most successful women entrepreneurs to share their stories. Women who had built businesses, managed ranches, and achieved independence that would have been impossible in more traditional Eastern communities. Senator Caldwell arrived precisely on schedule, accompanied by an entourage that included his formidable wife, two territorial officials, the Chicago newspaper correspondent, and various local politicians eager to be associated with such an important visit. Margaret had positioned herself in the main foyer to greet the guests, and she felt a moment of nervous uncertainty as the senator's carriage pulled up to the front entrance. Mrs. Caldwell proved to be exactly as challenging as Margaret had anticipated. A woman in her 50s, with steel-grey hair and sharp eyes that missed nothing, she had clearly arrived with preconceived notions about frontier society and the people who chose to live in such remote locations. Her first comments were politely dismissive, focusing on the quaint and rustic aspects of the ranch, in a tone that made it clear she considered these characteristics charming, but hardly suitable for serious political consideration. Margaret's strategy was to kill with kindness, while gradually demonstrating the sophistication and innovation of the community they had built. She began the tour with the ranch's business operations, allowing Will to showcase the scope and profitability of the enterprise. Then she moved to the educational facilities, where the visiting dignitaries were genuinely impressed by the quality of the schoolhouse and the advanced curriculum being offered to frontier children. But the real turning point came when Margaret introduced Mrs. Caldwell to some of the territory's remarkable women. There was Sarah Mitchell, who had inherited her husband's freight business and expanded it into the largest shipping operation between Denver and Omaha. There was Dr. Helena Rodriguez, one of the first women physicians in the territory, who had established clinics in 3 different communities. There was Martha Blackwood, a distant cousin of Will's, who had developed innovative agricultural techniques that had revolutionized farming in the region. Each of these women had stories that challenged Mrs. Caldwell's assumptions about frontier life. Rather than finding desperate people clinging to survival in primitive conditions, she encountered educated, articulate, successful individuals who had chosen frontier life because it offered opportunities unavailable elsewhere. The evening reception was Margaret's masterpiece of frontier diplomacy. She had managed to secure the military band from Fort Robinson, whose performance of both classical pieces and traditional frontier songs created exactly the right atmosphere of sophisticated culture adapted to regional character. The menu featured the finest local ingredients prepared with techniques that highlighted, rather than apologized for, regional cuisine. The decorations combined elegant Eastern-style arrangements with uniquely Western elements that celebrated rather than concealed the ranch's frontier identity. But the most effective element of the evening was Margaret herself. She moved through the reception with the poise of a Washington hostess, equally comfortable discussing territorial politics with the senator, comparing notes on household management with Mrs. Caldwell, and explaining the economic implications of various ranch innovations to the newspaper correspondent. She had become, without realizing it, the perfect embodiment of frontier sophistication, educated, capable, refined, but also practical, innovative, and uniquely adapted to the opportunities and challenges of territorial life. The newspaper correspondent, a cynical man named Frederick Hartwell, who had arrived expecting to write a condescending piece about frontier pretensions, found himself genuinely impressed by what he observed. He spent considerable time interviewing Margaret about the social programs she had developed, recognizing that these innovations represented something genuinely new in American community development. "Mrs. Sinclair," he said during a quiet moment. "On the ranch house veranda. I came here expecting to find people playing at civilization in the wilderness. Instead, I'm finding innovations that could revolutionize community development throughout the country. These programs you've created, the skills exchange, the correspondence network, the educational initiatives, they're addressing social problems that major cities haven't been able to solve." Margaret was surprised by his seriousness. "Mr. Hartwell, we're simply doing what needs to be done. When you live in isolated communities, you learn to rely on each other and to make the most of everyone's talents and resources. It's not revolutionary, it's just practical." "That's exactly what makes it revolutionary," Hartwell replied. "You've created systems that build community rather than simply managing populations. That's something Washington could learn from." The climax of the visit came on the final evening, when Senator Caldwell addressed the assembled gathering of ranch employees, neighboring families, and territorial officials. Margaret had spent weeks agonizing over every detail of this event, knowing that it would likely determine the senator's report on the territory's readiness for statehood. "Ladies and gentlemen," the senator began, "I came to this territory expecting to evaluate whether these remote communities were ready to take their place as full participants in American democracy. What I have found here has exceeded my expectations in ways I could not have imagined." He went on to praise the economic development, the educational initiatives, and the social innovations he had observed. But his most significant comments focused on the quality of leadership and community organization that had made such achievements possible. "In particular," he continued, "I want to acknowledge Mrs. Margaret Sinclair, whose work in community development represents the kind of innovative thinking that will be essential as America continues to grow and evolve. The programs she has created here are not just impressive local achievements, they are models that could benefit communities throughout our nation." Margaret felt herself blushing as applause filled the room. But she also felt a surge of pride and accomplishment unlike anything she had experienced since Thomas's death. She had found not just employment and security, but a true calling that allowed her to use her talents in service of something larger than herself. As the formal presentations concluded and the evening moved into more casual socializing, Will approached Margaret on the veranda, where she had stepped outside for a moment of quiet reflection. "Congratulations," he said quietly. "You've just been praised by a United States Senator as a model of American innovation. How does it feel to be famous?" Margaret laughed, feeling genuinely happy for the first time in months. "It feels terrifying and exhilarating at the same time, but mostly it feels like I've finally found where I belong." Will moved closer, and in the moonlight she could see something in his expression that made her heart race. "Margaret, I need to tell you something. This evening, watching you handle everything with such grace and intelligence, seeing the respect and admiration you've earned from everyone here, I realized that somewhere along the way, my feelings for you have moved far beyond professional appreciation." Margaret felt her breath catch. Over the past weeks, she had become increasingly aware of her growing attraction to Will, but she had convinced herself that her feelings were simply gratitude and professional respect. Now, hearing him voice what she had been afraid to acknowledge, she realized that her heart had been healing without her permission. "Will," she began, then stopped, unsure how to continue. "I know you're still in mourning," he said gently. "And I know you need time. I'm not asking for anything right now except the possibility that someday, when you're ready, you might consider whether what we've built together professionally could become something personal as well." Margaret looked at this man who had given her not just rescue from desperate circumstances, but the opportunity to discover capabilities she had never known she possessed. He had treated her as an equal partner, valued her intelligence, and supported her innovations without ever trying to control or diminish her contributions. "Will," she said finally, "I think that possibility might be closer than either of us expected." As they stood together on the veranda, looking out over the ranch that had become her home and the community that had become her calling, Margaret realized that she was no longer the desperate widow who had sat freezing at the depot just weeks earlier. She had become someone new, a woman of influence and capability, someone whose ideas could shape the future of an entire territory. And at the center of that transformation was the man standing beside her, who had seen her potential when she couldn't see it herself, and who had given her the opportunity to become everything she was meant to be. 3 months after Senator Caldwell's visit, Margaret was working in her office reviewing correspondence when Catherine burst through the door, her face pale with worry and clutching a telegram in her trembling hands. The success of the political reception had brought an avalanche of attention to the Blackwood Ranch, including numerous requests for Margaret to consult on community development projects throughout the territory. But the telegram Catherine carried would shatter the peaceful progress they had been enjoying. "Margaret, you need to see this immediately," Catherine said, her voice tight with anxiety. "It's from our lawyer in Omaha. There's been a development regarding Thomas's death that you need to know about." Margaret felt her blood turn cold at the mention of her late husband. She had finally begun to move beyond the grief and guilt that had consumed her for so long, and the last thing she wanted was to be dragged back into that painful chapter of her life. But Catherine's expression told her this was serious enough to demand immediate attention. The telegram was brief but devastating. "Investigation reveals Thomas Sinclair's death may not have been natural. Stop. Dr. Marcus Kellerman under suspicion for multiple patient deaths. Stop. Your testimony needed urgently. Stop. Travel to Omaha immediately. Stop. Signed, Attorney General Morrison." Margaret sank into her chair, the paper fluttering to the floor as her hands lost their strength. "I don't understand. Thomas died of consumption. I watched him waste away for months. How could his death be anything other than natural?" Catherine knelt beside her chair, picking up the telegram and reading it again with a lawyer's daughter's eye for detail. "Margaret, this Dr. Kellerman, was he Thomas's physician?" "Yes," Margaret whispered. "He was the only doctor in Millbrook. Thomas trusted him completely. We all did. He treated half the county." She looked up at Catherine with growing horror. "Are they saying he murdered my husband?" Before Catherine could answer, Will appeared in the doorway, obviously having heard the commotion. His face darkened as he took in Margaret's stricken expression and Catherine's worried demeanor. "What's happened?" Catherine quickly explained the contents of the telegram, while Will's expression grew increasingly grim. When she finished, he was quiet for a long moment, his jaw clenched with suppressed anger. "There's something else," he said finally. "Something I wasn't sure was connected until now. Jake rode in from town an hour ago with some disturbing news. There's been a man asking questions about you in Millbrook. A well-dressed stranger who's been talking to people about your marriage to Thomas, your financial situation, and your whereabouts since his death." Margaret felt the room spinning around her. What kind of questions? Questions about Thomas's medical treatment, about what happened to your property after his death, and specifically about whether you might have had any reason to want your husband dead. Will's voice was carefully controlled, but Margaret could see the fury burning in his eyes. The implication hit her like a physical blow. "They think I killed him. They think I murdered my own husband." Catherine immediately moved to comfort her, but Margaret stood abruptly, pacing to the window as her mind raced through the possibilities. "This doesn't make sense. If Dr. Kellerman was killing patients, why would anyone suspect me? And who is this stranger asking questions about me?" Will exchanged a meaningful glance with Catherine. "Margaret, I think you need to know something about Dr. Kellerman." I've been doing some research since we got word about the investigation. He's not just suspected of causing patient deaths. He's suspected of deliberately targeting wealthy patients and arranging their deaths to benefit from their property and possessions. But Thomas and I weren't wealthy, Margaret protested. We lost everything to his medical bills. Exactly, Catherine said quietly. Medical bills that were paid to Dr. Kellerman. Margaret, what if Thomas wasn't dying naturally? What if Kellerman was slowly poisoning him while collecting enormous fees for treating a disease he had caused? Margaret felt physically sick as the pieces began to fall into place. The prolonged illness that had drained their resources. The expensive treatments that seemed to help briefly before Thomas would relapse, the way Kellerman had always seemed to have a new and costly remedy to try. She had been so focused on caring for Thomas and managing their dwindling finances that she had never questioned the doctor's methods. "There's more," Will continued grimly. "The stranger asking questions about you isn't working for the territorial government. He's a private investigator hired by someone who seems very interested in discrediting you specifically." "But who would want to discredit me? And why?" The answer came from an unexpected source. Jake Morrison appeared in the doorway, hat in hand but expression urgent. "Mr. Blackwood, sorry to interrupt, but I think you need to see this right away. That investigator fellow got drunk in the saloon last night and started bragging about his mission. Turns out he's working for someone called Cornelius Blackwood." The silence that followed was deafening. Margaret looked back and forth between Will and Catherine, both of whom had gone rigid with shock and what looked like recognition. "Who is Cornelius Blackwood?" Margaret asked, though she was beginning. To suspect the answer would not be pleasant. Will's expression had turned thunderous. "My uncle, my father's older brother. The man who was supposed to inherit the ranch before my father bought him out and sent him back east 20 years ago. Catherine's face had gone white. "Will, if Cornelius is behind this investigation, it means he's planning something much bigger than just discrediting Margaret. He's never forgiven Father for choosing your father over him as heir to the family fortune." Margaret was struggling to follow the implications. "Are you saying that your uncle is trying to frame me for Thomas's murder in order to damage your reputation? But why would my situation affect you?" Will met her eyes directly, and she saw a mixture of anger, determination, and something deeper that made her heart race despite the circumstances. "Because, Margaret, anyone who's been paying attention knows that I intend to marry you. If you're accused of murdering your first husband, it would create a scandal that could destroy not just our personal happiness, but everything we've built here. The territorial government wouldn't grant statehood to a region whose most prominent citizens are associated with murder. The revelation that Will intended to marry her should have been joyous, but under the current circumstances, it felt like another piece of evidence in a conspiracy she was only beginning to understand. "There's something else you should know," Catherine said reluctantly. "Cornelius has been buying up land throughout the territory through various shell companies. If the statehood bid fails, those properties will lose most of their value, and he'll be able to acquire vast holdings for a fraction of their worth. He's essentially betting against the territory's future while simultaneously working to ensure that future fails." Margaret sank back into her chair as the full scope of the situation became clear. "So, he's using me as a weapon against the statehood movement. If I'm accused of murder, it discredits Will, which undermines the ranch's reputation, which damages the territory's chances for statehood, which allows him to profit from the resulting economic collapse." "That's exactly what he's doing," Will confirmed grimly. "And the worst part is, it's a brilliant strategy. Even if we can prove your innocence, the mere accusation will be enough to create doubt and suspicion. In frontier communities, reputation is everything." Jake cleared his throat awkwardly. "There's more, Mr. Blackwood. The investigator mentioned that there's going to be an official territorial marshal arriving within the week to arrest Mrs. Sinclair on suspicion of murder. Apparently they've found a witness who claims to have seen her purchasing poison in a general store in Millbrook. Margaret stood up sharply, her initial shock giving way to anger. That's impossible. I never purchased any poison. I can account for every penny I spent during Thomas's illness, and most of it went directly to Dr. Kellerman for his treatments. Which means either the witness is lying or someone has created false evidence, Will said. Probably both. Cornelius has enough money to buy whatever testimony he needs. Catherine was pacing now, her legal mind working through the possibilities. We need to get ahead of this. If we wait for the marshal to arrive, Margaret will be arrested and taken away for trial. Even if we eventually prove her innocence, the damage to her reputation and to the ranch will be done. What are you suggesting? Will asked. We go on the offensive. We travel to Omaha immediately and present our evidence to the Attorney General before the arrest warrant can be executed. We expose Cornelius's conspiracy and Dr. Kellerman's crimes at the same time. If we can prove that Thomas was murdered by Kellerman as part of a pattern of killing patients for profit, it establishes Margaret's innocence while also revealing the conspiracy against the territory. Margaret felt a surge of determination replace her fear and confusion. Catherine's right. I won't run from false accusations, and I won't let your uncle destroy everything we've built here. But I want to do more than just clear my name. I want to expose the entire conspiracy and make sure Cornelius faces justice for what he's done. Will looked at her with admiration and something deeper. Margaret, you realize that fighting this means putting yourself at considerable risk. If we fail, you could face execution for murder. And if we don't fight, you could lose everything you've worked for, and the territory could lose its chance at statehood, Margaret replied firmly. I won't be responsible for destroying the dreams of hundreds of families just to save myself from false accusations. The next several hours were a whirlwind of preparation and planning. Catherine dispatched telegrams to allies in the territorial government and to lawyers who had experience with complex criminal cases. Will organized a trusted group of ranch hands to maintain operations while the family dealt with the crisis. Margaret gathered every document related to Thomas's illness and death, including receipts for medical treatments and correspondence with Dr. Kellerman. But their most important ally proved to be someone unexpected. Dr. Helena Rodriguez, the pioneering female physician who had attended the reception, arrived at the ranch unannounced just as they were preparing to leave for Omaha. I came as soon as I heard about the investigation, she announced without preamble. Margaret, I've been reviewing medical records throughout the territory, and I've found a pattern of suspicious deaths that all trace back to Dr. Kellerman. Moreover, I've discovered something that could be crucial to your defense. She opened her medical bag and withdrew a small vial filled with white powder. This is arsenic, the same poison that's been found in the bodies of several of Kellerman's patients. But here's what's interesting. Arsenic poisoning produces very specific symptoms that can be mistaken for consumption if the doses are carefully controlled over time. Margaret felt her heart racing as the implications became clear. You're saying that Thomas's symptoms were consistent with arsenic poisoning rather than natural disease? I'm saying it's highly probable, and if we can prove that Kellerman was systematically poisoning patients while collecting fees for treating the symptoms he was causing, it establishes both the doctor's guilt and your innocence. Will stepped forward, his expression intense. Dr. Rodriguez, would you be willing to testify to these findings before the territorial authorities? I'd be willing to do more than that, she replied with a fierce smile. I've been building a case against Kellerman for months, but I've been working alone because no one wanted to believe that a respected doctor could be a systematic murderer. With your resources and connections, we can expose not just Kellerman, but the entire conspiracy. As they prepared to leave for Omaha, Margaret realized that this crisis, terrifying as it was, had revealed something important about the community they had built and the relationships they had formed. People were willing to risk their own safety and reputation to help her fight for justice. Catherine was putting her legal expertise at Margaret's disposal, despite the potential damage to the family name. Dr. Rodriguez was risking her medical career to expose a colleague's crimes. Will was prepared to use all his resources and influence to protect her, even though association with a suspected murderess could destroy everything he had worked for. But perhaps most importantly, Margaret had discovered something about herself. She was no longer the helpless widow who had sat freezing at the depot, waiting for someone else to determine her fate. She had become a woman capable of fighting for herself and for the principles she believed in, even when the stakes were life and death. As their carriage rolled toward Omaha, carrying evidence that could either clear her name or seal her doom, Margaret felt a strange sense of calm determination. She had found her strength, her purpose, and her love. Now she would discover whether those were enough to overcome a conspiracy designed to destroy everything she held dear. The battle for her life, Will's future, and the territory's destiny was about to begin. The territorial courthouse in Omaha was packed to capacity with spectators, journalists, and political figures who had traveled from across the region to witness what newspapers were calling the trial of the century. Margaret sat at the defendant's table, wearing a simple but elegant navy dress that Catherine had chosen to project dignity and respectability. Despite the gravity of her situation, she maintained her composure with the same steadiness that had carried her through every crisis since Thomas's death. The prosecution's case had been devastating in its apparent thoroughness. District Attorney Harrison Blackwood, Cornelius's son and Will's cousin, had painted Margaret as a calculating woman who had systematically poisoned her husband while pretending to care for him. The prosecution's star witness, a general store clerk named Samuel Pierce, had testified that Margaret had purchased arsenic on 3 separate occasions, claiming she needed it for rat poison, but acting nervous and suspicious each time. "Ladies and gentlemen of the jury," Harrison had declared in his opening statement, "the evidence will show that Mrs. Margaret Sinclair married Thomas Sinclair not for love, but for the modest property and savings he possessed." When she realized that a lingering illness would drain those resources while keeping her tied to an increasingly burdensome invalid, she chose murder as her solution. The prosecution had also produced medical testimony from Dr. Kellerman himself, who appeared, as a respected physician, genuinely shocked to learn that his patient had been poisoned. Kellerman testified that he had found Margaret's behavior during Thomas's illness increasingly suspicious, noting that the patient's condition seemed to worsen after visits from his wife, but that he had been reluctant to voice his concerns about a grieving woman. But Margaret's defense team had spent the past 3 weeks uncovering evidence that would transform the trial from a simple murder case into an exposure of territorial-wide corruption. Lead defense attorney Samuel Morrison, the Attorney General's brother and one of the territory's most respected legal minds, had methodically built a case that would shock the courtroom and rewrite the history of Nebraska Territory. "Your Honor," Morrison announced as he began the defense case, "we intend to prove not only that Mrs. Sinclair is innocent of murdering her husband, but that she is herself the victim of an elaborate conspiracy designed to destroy her reputation, ruin the Blackwood family, and sabotage Nebraska Territory's bid for statehood." The first bombshell came when Dr. Helena Rodriguez took the stand. She had spent weeks analyzing medical records from across the territory, and her findings were devastating to the prosecution's case. "Dr. Rodriguez," Morrison asked, "based on your investigation of Dr. Kellerman's patients over the past 5 years, what did you discover?" I discovered a pattern of suspicious deaths among Dr. Kellerman's wealthiest patients, she replied calmly. In every case, the patients suffered from a prolonged, expensive illness that drained their financial resources before ultimately proving fatal. Moreover, the symptoms described in the medical records are consistent with chronic arsenic poisoning rather than the natural diseases that were diagnosed. The courtroom erupted in shocked murmurs as Dr. Rodriguez methodically presented evidence of what appeared to be systematic medical murder. She had identified 17 cases where Dr. Kellerman's patients had died under suspicious circumstances, in each case after expensive and prolonged treatment that had consumed the patient's assets. But the most dramatic moment came when Morrison called his next witness, Dr. Marcus Kellerman himself, this time as a hostile witness rather than a prosecution ally. "Dr. Kellerman," Morrison began, "you testified earlier that you suspected Mrs. Sinclair of poisoning her husband. But isn't it true that you yourself administered arsenic to Thomas Sinclair as part of his medical treatment?" Kellerman's confident demeanor cracked slightly. "I administered various medications as appropriate for his condition." Morrison produced a medical journal from Kellerman's own office. "According to your notes, you prescribed Fowler's solution for Mr. Sinclair's condition. Can you tell the court what Fowler's solution contains?" "It's a common medical preparation," Kellerman replied evasively. "Doctor, please answer the question. What does Fowler's solution contain?" "Arsenic," Kellerman admitted reluctantly. "But in therapeutic doses for medical purposes." Morrison turned to face the jury. "So you administered arsenic to Thomas Sinclair over a period of months, collecting substantial fees for this treatment, and when he died of arsenic poisoning, you immediately suspected his wife of murder?" The prosecution objected, but the damage was done. Morrison then produced financial records showing that Kellerman had purchased properties previously owned by several of his deceased patients, often at dramatically reduced prices from desperate widows who needed quick cash to pay outstanding medical bills. The courtroom was in chaos as the implications became clear. Dr. Kellerman was not just guilty of malpractice, he was operating a systematic scheme to murder wealthy patients while profiting from both their medical treatment and their subsequent deaths. But Morrison wasn't finished. His next witness was a private investigator named Charles Whitmore, who had been hired by an anonymous client to investigate financial irregularities in territorial land purchases. "Mr. Whitmore," Morrison asked, "what did your investigation reveal about recent land acquisitions in Nebraska Territory?" "I discovered that multiple shell companies have been purchasing property throughout the territory at below-market prices, often from widows or families facing financial distress. These companies all trace back to a single investor based in Chicago. And who is that investor? Mr. Cornelius Blackwood, uncle of defendant's employer, Mr. William Blackwood." Morrison then presented evidence that Cornelius had been systematically undermining the territory's statehood bid while simultaneously positioning himself to profit from the resulting economic instability. The scheme was breathtaking in its scope and audacity. Cornelius had been betting against the territory's future while actively working to ensure that future failed. The prosecution's case was crumbling, but Harrison Blackwood made one last desperate attempt to salvage the situation. He recalled Samuel Pierce, the store clerk who had testified about Margaret purchasing arsenic. "Mr. Pierce," Harrison asked, "are you absolutely certain it was the defendant who purchased arsenic from your store?" "Well," Pierce said, fidgeting nervously, "I thought it was her," but Morrison immediately stood for cross-examination. "Mr. Pierce, how much were you paid to testify against Mrs. Sinclair?" "I wasn't paid nothing," Pierce protested, but his eyes darted toward the prosecution table. Morrison produced a bank receipt showing a substantial deposit to Pierce's account just days before his testimony. Under intense questioning, Pierce finally broke down and admitted, that he had been paid to lie about Margaret purchasing arsenic. He had never seen her in his store. The courtroom erupted as Pierce tearfully confessed that he had been approached by a well-dressed man from Chicago who had offered him more money than he made in a year to testify against Margaret. The man had provided him with detailed descriptions of Margaret and coached him on his testimony. Judge William Crawford called for order, but the damage to the prosecution's case was irreversible. Without Pierce's testimony, there was no evidence connecting Margaret to any arsenic purchase, while the defense had systematically demonstrated that Dr. Kellerman had both the means and opportunity to poison Thomas Sinclair as part of a broader criminal enterprise. But the trial's most dramatic moment was yet to come. Morrison called Margaret herself to the stand, a risky decision that would allow her to tell her story directly to the jury, but also expose her to potentially devastating cross-examination. Margaret walked to the witness stand with quiet dignity, and for the first time since the trial began, the courtroom fell completely silent. Here was the woman at the center of the conspiracy, facing the possibility of execution, yet maintaining her composure with remarkable grace. "Mrs. Sinclair," Morrison began gently, "please tell the court about your relationship with your late husband." Margaret's voice was steady and clear as she described her marriage to Thomas, their dreams for their homestead, and the devastating illness that had consumed their resources and ultimately claimed his life. She spoke with genuine emotion about her love for Thomas and her desperate attempts to save him, sparing no detail about the months of watching him slowly waste away, despite Dr. Kellerman's expensive treatments. "Did you ever suspect that Dr. Kellerman might be harming your husband rather than helping him?" "Never," Margaret replied firmly. "He was the only doctor available, and we trusted him completely. When Thomas would seem to improve after Dr. Kellerman's visits, only to relapse a few days later, I thought it was just the natural course of his illness. I blamed myself for not being able to do more to help him. Mrs. Sinclair, did you ever purchase arsenic for any purpose?" "No, I did not. I can account for every penny we spent during Thomas's illness, and most of it went directly to Dr. Kellerman for his treatments and medications." Harrison Blackwood's cross-examination was brutal, but Margaret held her ground. He tried to paint her as a fortune hunter who had married Thomas for his modest assets, but Margaret's genuine grief and detailed knowledge of their financial struggles made this accusation ring hollow. He suggested that she had killed Thomas to escape the burden of caring for an invalid, but Margaret's obvious love for her late husband and her detailed testimony about the care she had provided undermined this theory. Most importantly, Harrison could not explain how Margaret could have administered poison to Thomas when Dr. Kellerman's own medical records showed that he had been giving the victim arsenic as part of his treatment regimen. Morrison's closing argument was masterful. He systematically demolished the prosecution's case while painting Margaret as the victim of a conspiracy designed to destroy innocent people for financial and political gain. "Ladies and gentlemen," he declared, "you have heard evidence of a conspiracy so vast and callous that it defies belief. Dr. Kellerman systematically murdered patients for profit, while Cornelius Blackwood manipulated territorial politics for personal gain. Mrs. Sinclair was to be their final victim, a convenient scapegoat whose destruction would serve both their financial and political objectives." He concluded by addressing the broader implications of the case. "This trial is about more than one woman's innocence or guilt. It is about whether justice will prevail over corruption, whether truth will triumph over conspiracy, whether the citizens of Nebraska Territory will be allowed to build their future free from the manipulation of those who would profit from their misery." The jury deliberated for less than 2 hours before returning with their verdict. Margaret stood as the foreman announced, "We, the jury, find the defendant Margaret Rose Sinclair not guilty of all charges." The courtroom exploded in cheers and applause. Margaret felt her knees buckle with relief, but Will was there to catch her, holding her close as tears of joy and exhaustion streamed down her face. But the trial's impact extended far beyond Margaret's. Personal vindication. Within hours of the verdict, territorial marshals had arrested Dr. Kellerman on multiple charges of murder, and federal investigators were pursuing Cornelius Blackwood for conspiracy and fraud. The exposure of the plot to sabotage statehood actually strengthened Nebraska Territory's case for admission to the Union, as it demonstrated both the sophistication of territorial legal institutions and the determination of territorial citizens to resist corruption. Judge Crawford's final comments from the bench captured the significance of the moment. This trial has demonstrated that Nebraska Territory possesses both the legal institutions and the moral character necessary for statehood. Mrs. Sinclair's courage in fighting false accusations, combined with the determination of territorial citizens to expose corruption and seek justice, proves that this territory is ready to take its place as a full member of our union. As Margaret and Will left the courthouse together, surrounded by supporters and well-wishers, she realized that the ordeal had transformed her in ways she was only beginning to understand. She was no longer simply a widow who had been rescued. From desperate circumstances, she had become a symbol of frontier justice, a woman whose courage in the face of false accusations had helped expose territorial-wide corruption and strengthen the case for statehood. More importantly, she had proven to herself that she possessed the strength and determination to face any challenge. The frightened woman who had sat shivering at the depot less than a year ago had become someone capable of standing up to powerful enemies and fighting for truth and justice, regardless of the personal cost. The conspiracy had been defeated, but Margaret's greatest victory was discovering who she had become in the process of fighting it. 5 years after the trial that had captivated the nation, Margaret stood on the grand staircase of the governor's mansion in Lincoln, the newly designated capital of the state of Nebraska. She wore an elegant emerald gown that perfectly complemented her auburn hair, now crowned with a simple but exquisite diamond tiara that had belonged to Will's grandmother. Tonight marked the 5th anniversary of Nebraska's admission to the Union, and Margaret Blackwood, as the state's First Lady, was hosting the most important social gathering in the young state's history. The transformation had been extraordinary. The trial's aftermath had created a wave of reform that swept through the territory like wildfire. Dr. Kellerman had been sentenced to life imprisonment, while Cornelius Blackwood's financial empire had collapsed when federal investigators exposed the full scope of his fraudulent land schemes. The publicity surrounding the conspiracy had actually accelerated Nebraska's path to statehood, as Congress was eager to demonstrate that justice prevailed on the American frontier. Will's election as Nebraska's first state governor had been almost inevitable. His reputation for honest dealing, combined with Margaret's fame as the woman who had helped expose territorial corruption, made them the natural choice to lead the new state into the future. Margaret had proven to be a political asset beyond Will's wildest dreams, drawing on her experience in community organization to build coalitions that crossed party lines and regional boundaries. But tonight's celebration was about more than political achievements. It was about the realization of a vision that had begun when a desperate widow met a compassionate rancher at a lonely depot 5 years earlier. Margaret moved gracefully through the crowded ballroom, stopping to greet dignitaries from Washington, foreign diplomats, business leaders, and the territorial pioneers who had become personal friends over the years. The guest list represented a cross-section of American society that would have been unimaginable in the early frontier days. Senators and cattle ranchers, university presidents and homestead wives, industrial magnates and frontier doctors, all. gathered to celebrate Nebraska's emergence as a modern American state. "Governor Blackwood, Mrs. Blackwood," announced the master of ceremonies, "President Cleveland has asked me to read a special message commemorating this anniversary." The ballroom fell silent as the presidential letter was read aloud, praising Nebraska's rapid development and specifically mentioning Margaret's innovative community programs, which had been adopted by frontier settlements across the American West. The president's letter concluded with an invitation for the Blackwoods to visit the White House as honored guests of the nation. As applause filled the ballroom, Margaret caught Will's eye across the crowd. Even after 3 years of marriage, she still felt that familiar flutter when their eyes met. Their wedding had been a statewide celebration, attended by thousands of people who considered them symbols of Nebraska's triumph over adversity. But beyond the public symbolism, their private relationship had deepened into the kind of partnership that neither had dared to hope for during those early uncertain months. "Ladies and gentlemen," Will announced when the applause subsided, "my wife has a special announcement regarding our plans for Nebraska's continued development." Margaret stepped forward, her voice carrying clearly through the vast ballroom. 3 years ago, I proposed the creation of a Nebraska Women's Educational Initiative. Tonight, I'm proud to announce that construction will begin next month on the state's first university campus specifically designed to provide higher education opportunities for women. The Margaret Sinclair Blackwood Institute will offer degree programs in medicine, law, education, and business administration. The announcement created a sensation. Margaret had quietly raised the necessary funds through a combination of federal grants, private donations, and innovative revenue-sharing agreements with businesses throughout the state. The institute would be the first of its kind west of the Mississippi River, and applications were already pouring in from young women across the American frontier. Dr. Helena Rodriguez, now the state's Surgeon General, approached Margaret with tears of joy in her eyes. "Margaret, you've just changed the future for thousands of women. When I think of the opportunities this will create." "It's what any of us would have done," Margaret replied, though she was clearly moved by the emotion of the moment. "We're building a state where everyone has the chance to achieve their potential, regardless of their background or circumstances." The evening's most poignant moment came when Emily Patterson, now Mrs. Emily Patterson Harrison, stepped forward with a 6-month-old daughter in her arms. Emily had married her Colorado rancher 2 years earlier, but she had returned to Nebraska to serve as the Institute's first Dean of Education. "Mrs. Blackwood," Emily said softly, "I want my daughter to grow up in a world where the opportunities you've created are taken for granted. Thank you for showing us all what's possible when we refuse to accept limitations." As the evening wound down and the last guests departed, Margaret and Will found themselves alone on the mansion's moonlit veranda, looking out over the city of Lincoln. The scattered lights below represented a community of nearly 50,000 people, while similar communities throughout the state had grown and prospered in ways that would have seemed impossible just a few years earlier. "Do you ever think about that night at the depot?" Will asked, taking Margaret's hand in his. "When I found you sitting there with everything you owned in that little carpet bag." Margaret smiled, remembering the desperate woman she had been such a short time ago. "I think about her often. She was so frightened, so convinced that her life was over. If she could see tonight, see what we've built together, I don't think she would believe it was possible." "I knew that night that you were extraordinary," Will said, "but I never imagined that helping one woman would ultimately transform an entire state." Margaret turned to face him, struck by the truth of his observation. "That's what I've learned about frontier life, Will. Every act of kindness, every moment of courage, every refusal to accept defeat, they all ripple outward in ways we can never predict. You saved my life that night, but by saving my life, you helped save thousands of others." Their conversation was interrupted by the arrival of a telegraph messenger with an urgent communication from Washington. Margaret opened it with some trepidation, but her expression quickly changed to amazement. "Will, you need to see this. President, Cleveland is asking you to chair a national commission on frontier development. They want us to travel throughout the Western Territories and help other communities implement the programs we've developed here in Nebraska." Will read the telegram with growing excitement. "Margaret, this could extend our influence far beyond Nebraska's borders. We could help shape the development of the entire American West." "More than that," Margaret replied, her mind already racing with possibilities. "We could help ensure that every territory develops with the same commitment to education, opportunity, and community welfare that we've established here." They spent the rest of the evening planning their response to the president's invitation and discussing the implications of such a national role. But as dawn approached, their conversation turned to more personal matters. "Margaret," Will said quietly, "there's something I've been wanting to tell you. When Dr. Mitchell examined you last month, he mentioned that we might want to start thinking about expanding our family." Margaret felt her heart skip a beat. They had been trying to have children for over a year, and the possibility of pregnancy had become a source of both hope and anxiety. "Will, are you saying—" "I'm saying that Nebraska's future might include a new generation of Blackwoods to carry on what we've started here." Margaret threw her arms around her husband's neck, tears of joy streaming down her face. "Will, if that's true, then our story really will have changed the entire territory. Our children will grow up in a state we helped create with opportunities we fought to establish." As the sun rose over Nebraska's capital city, casting golden light across the prairie that stretched to the horizon, Margaret reflected on the extraordinary journey that had brought her to this moment. She had begun as a desperate widow with nothing but grief and a small carpetbag. She had become the First Lady of a state, a national advocate for women's education, and a symbol of frontier opportunity. But more than any public achievement, she had discovered the transformative power of love, courage, and community. She had learned that individual acts of kindness could reshape entire societies, and that personal strength could emerge from the deepest despair. The love story that began at a lonely depot had indeed changed the whole territory, but its influence would extend far beyond Nebraska's borders. Margaret and Will's partnership would help shape the development of the American West for generations to come, creating opportunities for countless families who would follow in their footsteps. Their story had become legend, told and retold across the frontier as proof that in America anyone could rise above their circumstances and help build a better future. The frightened widow and the compassionate rancher had become symbols of the frontier spirit that would define American character for generations to come. As Margaret looked out over the state they had helped create, she knew that their greatest adventures still lay ahead. Together, they would continue building a society based on opportunity, justice, and the belief that every person deserved the chance to achieve their dreams. The depot where their story began was now a historical landmark, visited by travelers who came to see where the love story that transformed a territory had first unfolded. But for Margaret and Will, it was simply the starting point of a partnership that would continue shaping American history for decades to come. Their love had indeed changed everything, creating ripples of influence that would spread across the continent and inspire generations of Americans to believe in the power of compassion, courage, and the transformative potential of love. Up next, you've got two more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out, and don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.